Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. That's definitely a point I would sign up to, and it's one that, yeah, I didn't make in the talk, but I definitely think holds here, that, you know, we have this model from Carruthers of things happening over here and things happening over there, but, you know, I think that's not the way that most neuroscientists think of it. It's much more integrated, much more fuzzy, and, you know, any claims about brain plasticity are going to be problematic for this kind of picture. So, yeah, so I think it's not, and it's interesting because, you know, so there is lots and lots to really, really like in the book. I don't want to give the impression that there's not, and he, you know, it's great. God, this is being recorded. And he's really good on lots and lots of the individual bits of evidence, but I do think this overall framework that he ends up with is kind of weird, given the sensitivity that he does have to, you know, work in psychology, work in neuroscience. It feels odd to me. So, yeah, that's just to agree. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so a couple of points. One, I was just curious why you limit common sense psychology or everyday psychology only to this beliefs, desires realm, because, for example, it's very common for us to talk about somebody doing something on a whim, or they don't have access to the reasons why they did something. It's like, why do you love that piece of music? Well, it just moves me in this way. I mean, so it's not a belief desire framework. So I was a little bit curious about that.
Great question, and I should have been a bit clearer at the start. So it's often called the belief desire psychology model, but I would absolutely want to distance myself from that, because it's all kinds of, what I take to be key were those two claims about mentalizing and about reasons, and clearly other kinds of mental states beside beliefs and desires. But also, I think you're right. Okay, so you might say, so just to finish that point, yeah, all kinds of mental states can play a role here, and I think what's special about common sense psychology is it's up to and including genuinely propositional states. So then you might think, well, what about emotions and affective kinds of states? So there are different things you can say about them. Clearly, some of them play a genuine reason-giving role, right? You can say, why did he hurl the plate? Because he was angry, and that's an explanation. Why do you like that music? Because it moves me. That gives you a reason, and that's, you know, philosophically, that's definitely a move people have wanted to make. I do feel the draw that there may be some kinds of effective responses that are just, yeah, maybe not even getting into that sphere of giving us a reason, that it's just such an immediate trigger. You know, the example I gave you, scratching an itch or you know, laughing when you're tickled, they may be cases where it doesn't even get as reasony as that, you know, it's not even that kind of case. But I think you're absolutely right to think that affective states and other things beside beliefs and desires play a role here, and it's problematic that we use that lit terminology of belief desire. But yeah, you wanted to...
So, I mean, I'm a little bit curious. I'm a psychologist, and from our point of view, we would always, I mean, at least in my field, we would always distinguish between a rational model, so that is a model which a dispassionate observer could understand the series of reasons and normative reasons why something has happened, and the actual kind of cognitive process of reasoning. And you seem to be conflating those two things. So ball catching, a friend of mine works on ball catching, and it's a rational actor model, but it doesn't mean that he thinks that the person that's catching the ball is reasoning through the processes that they have to do. There are many, many unconscious processes. So I was a bit confused by that.
So I think that's exactly right. But I think that's pressing on this question, right, about whether what a heuristic is doing is just bypassing entirely. So we can create a rational reconstruction, but nothing in the agent realizes anything like that process. And I think that is the claim that I want to get away with. And you said many, many unconscious processes. That's fine. Right. As long as there's something going on that doesn't just mean you're going from trigger to action. Right. That's the problem, right? Because I want to be much more concessive than old-style belief desire psychology about what looks like a reason-driven bit of behavior. The unconscious stuff is absolutely fine for me, but it's just, there's got to be a something. It can't just be that, you know, a kind of Dennett style, we can reconstruct an account of this person. There's got to be something going on the inside that mirrors it, I think.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks. See, look, I said to James I'd take questions, and now I can't even remember who put their hand up. I'm going to go Chris, lady here, person there.
It sort of picks up on the point that Roland Fleming was just making. The paradigmatic explanation in common sense psychology invokes standing states, believing that there is a cookie in a jar, wanting a cookie. These are standing states, not events, even if they don't last very long. But I suppose that if you want to extend the reach of common sense psychology into the explanation of events that are largely stimulus-driven, because you want to allow that we may become aware that the circumstances have changed and change our course, then the propositional attitudes that you will invoke will be more events, realizing that the vessel is empty or something like that. Do you acknowledge that, or do you still want to think of the explainers in the case of the largely stimulus-driven behaviors as these standing states rather than events?
I guess I'm wondering what the force of the question is here, and so what turns on giving an answer either way. But I guess what I'm thinking is that when you're engaging in the action, it can be just these kinds of standing states that are playing in the role. Certainly when you modulate what you're doing because of changes in the environment or whatever, there may have to be an event that recognizes that alteration. But I think my thought is that that event couldn't do the work required if we had a picture of sort of stimulus-driven habitual behavior as just this sort of immediate triggering of a blind motor process that operates in this fixed, rigid way, so that once you've clicked it into action at the beginning, it's all going to happen unless, there's an actual physical barrier to what you're doing. Is that helpful? Probably
so
not.
We'll still invoke, what we'll be invoking from common sense psychology's awareness of the possibility that the vessel might be open and that's a standing state and not an event?
No, so I think, so if we're thinking about the case where I'm making tea and someone tells me the milk isn't in the fridge, it's on the side, there'll be an event, which is my recognition of what's been said to me, right? My processing of that verbal interaction. That's a current, that's happening now, and that will influence what I'm doing. But if that hadn't happened, my behavior, my movement towards the fridge to get the milk out, is still reasons responsive. It's responding to these standing states. Okay, we can chat. I feel like I haven't convinced. I was going over here now.
Super, thank you. So I was just wondering if you were just interested in acting for a reason as opposed to believing for reasons, holding emotions for reasons, etc., etc. So a lot of what you say seems to carry over, but also so you use like the feminist, the Linda case and things like that, and that's not actually talking about acting on the basis of heuristics, that's forming judgments, right? And so that, it seemed to be there, you're talking something about forming judgments for reasons, and I think like the point about consciousness, I think it would be easier to make if you're thinking about believing for reasons, because I think it's funny, like, all the action people seem to like take as an assumption that acting for a reason is self-conscious, but then as soon as you get into the epistemic basing literature, then if you're trying to say that basing requires self-consciousness, then you have like papers like Ramnetta arguing that yes, but that's more controversial claims. So yeah, I was wondering, do you want to extend that? Because I think that you should, and I think it's probably easier for you with the literature to extend it in that way.
Okay, great. That's a great and very friendly question, so thank you very much. I guess I was thinking of the Linda case as an action because, you're telling someone which one am I choosing. Okay. But I think I hadn't thought very much about the difference between kind of overt action and internal action, like, judgment formation. But I think I would want to say the same thing about that I say about the external case, and I think you might well be right that it would be, that the point about consciousness may play out differently depending on which kind of action, I guess I would call both of them action, but which kind of thing, kind of results you're interested in. So that's, I'm just going to take that away and think about it. I think that's very helpful. Thank you. I feel like, Nick, did you have... Okay, I'm going to go person behind Nick and then Michael and then there, I think. How are we doing? Will you tell me when we're stopping for coffee? Okay.
Thank you. So this is about your response to the heuristics challenge, and I was wondering what you thought was the right thing to say about kind of positively what the reasons actually are that we act on in some of these cases. So let's take the example of reaching for the apple that's on the top shelf rather than the candy. So you deny that in general reasons need to be conscious, and that sort of suggested to me that maybe you want to say, well, it's actually the availability of the apple that could be the reason, but I think that doesn't sit very well with the thought that's, I think, essential to these commonsensical psychological framework, which is that these reasons explain by justifying, right? So I just wondering.
Okay, yeah, great question, and I think there is just lots and lots to say about that. I mean, I think part of the problem I have with the heuristics and biases literature is, as I kind of alluded to in the talk, that it has a massive kind of trawler effect of a big bucket of cases, and you might just want to say something different about lots and lots of the cases, So I think as a philosopher, you don't want to be, you don't want to face a tsunami of evidence as one. You want to try and break it down into different things maybe going on in different kinds of cases. I think that's one thing to say. But then in general, absolutely, I think the way you were going is the way that I would want to go. So I'm quite taken with Neil Levy has a nice book on this quite recently where he thinks about kind of higher order evidence that you can appeal to. So, maybe not in the Apple case, but you might take the fact that someone has made something particularly salient to you as providing kind of evidence that that's the right thing or that's the thing they think you should go for. In these kinds of cases, so I mean, I do think that I would want to sign up to an idea that what we're doing when we're making decisions is looking for a good enough solution, not an ideal solution. So I think I agree with a lot of what many people in this area want to say. So people like Gigerenzer, I think, are fine here from my point of view to think that we have these kinds of rules of thumb that get us good enough responses. So in the Apple case, I've got 101 decisions that I need to make in my day. Probably a lot more than that, The Apple one is a really minor choice that I've got to make, and I should not spend too much time making it. This is all the stuff that heuristics and biases tell us. We've got limited cognitive resources. What would be irrational in the Apple case, I think, is going into a shop to buy a snack and coming out with an apple as a snack when I don't like apples. Okay, if that happens, something's really gone wrong. If I go into the shop for a snack and I buy an apple because it's the first thing I see and it's a good enough solution to my problem, wanting a snack, and I buy the apple, that for me is fine, right? I've used reasons. I wanted a snack, and that's a snack. Good enough. I could have spent a lot more time looking at other options, but I shouldn't do that because I've got to decide what I'm putting in my slides for tomorrow's talk or whatever. Is this helping? I don't know.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think that's maybe suggesting that it's not the heuristic of the availability of the apple itself, which is the reason, but then you don't need to, I think, necessarily deny the conscious availability of that reason. It's your wanting the snack and the fact that there's a snack there. So maybe in other cases, it's more important for your response to deny. So, I mean, I take your point that we might not want to give the same answer to different kinds of cases, but yeah.
Yeah. And, there's going to be unconscious and unconscious, isn't there? There's things that, I might not have been thinking about at the time, but that I can recover to consciousness very easily. And there are things that are much harder to recover. And, there is a worry with the line that I want to take, which is, well, hang on. You don't want to say that every single kind of content-sensitive transition that happens in the mind of the individual counts as a reasons-based transition. It's got to be more than that. And so you do need a candidate for what makes it more than that. And consciousness does look like a good candidate. It's just that I think it doesn't play out when you get to it. But I do think a comeback from an opponent would definitely be, yeah, but what criterion are you going to use? You need something here to up the ante on just content-based transition. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Michael. Thank you very much.
in cognitive psychology, which is a distinction between procedural knowledge and declarative knowledge. And procedural knowledge, a central thing about it is it isn't declarative knowledge and doesn't involve declarative knowledge. And then there's an enormous amount of literature about what it might consist in itself. Now, it seems a bit something that you would need to take account of because they identify skills with procedural knowledge. So how do you sort of accommodate that distinction in cognitive psychology with your line?
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's a really good question, and I think I might just say I'm going to take it away and think about it because it's not a distinction that I've made use of as yet.
I mean, they also have very nice arguments, of course, to do with learning about how there's two sorts of learning, explicit and implicit learning.
Yeah.
And explicit learning starts with declarative knowledge and implicit doesn't. So there's lots of stuff going on, lots of key distinctions in cognitive psychology. I just wonder how you're accommodating them.
I mean, I think that's a good question, and I think I would have to sit down quietly and try and map across from those kinds of cases. But in general, I think what I'm going to want to say is the kind of point that I ended up at the end, which is, we need to do a kind of case-by-case or idea-by-idea kind of approach here. And it may well turn out that there are genuinely things that we do that we don't do for reasons, that we do, that are genuinely intentional things that we don't do for reasons. I think that can still sit with the kind of assumption of rationality and scope of common sense psychology that I want, because it's not going to turn out that all skills look like that, right? So as you said, some of them are going to, the explicitly learned cases are going to depend on propositional knowledge in the kind of way that I want.
But the idea is that there are different ways to acquire a skill. And the last I looked, the idea was that most skills are acquired through implicit learning, which doesn't even start from declarative knowledge. But however you get there, what you end up with, as I understand the literature, is a procedural knowledge which does not involve declarative knowledge.
Yeah, but then I think I'm just going to go back to this worry that I have, that if you have something totally non-declarative and totally motoric, it doesn't account properly for the degree of integration. So, I'm thinking about kind of Papineau's stuff on cricket players here. I'm out in the middle and I'm facing a cricket ball and I'm going to play a shot. That is the most kind of skillsy type thing. You've got almost no time to respond. You've got to go. But still, it can be highly sensitive to the wider cognitive framework of the individual. They may think to themselves, given the stage the game is at, this is the kind of shot I should be playing, or these are the set of shots I should be selecting from, or, I should be this aggressive and not that aggressive. And I think my worry is that if you end up with a picture of skill that makes it just this kind of brute triggering, motoric, rolling out automatically, kind of blindly picture, then you're not going to get enough of that cognitive integration.
Yeah. I don't know that anyone does that. I mean, sport is my favorite examples here. What you're saying about cricket is just very true, that it helps enormously to have anticipated, which is obviously a rational process, what's going to come.
Yeah.
It's very, very striking in baseball. Batters who anticipate correctly what the pitch is going to be do much, much better.
Yeah. So I think in general, the complaint has been from heuristics and biases that common sense psychology is over-intellectualizing everyday behavior. But I think, as we're going to hopefully see in the panel that's coming up, the response should really be that we should up the intellectualization of ordinary behavior. What we're doing is just much smarter than this kind of dumbing down picture gives us reason to believe. And I like the fact that a talk by an English person with a question ends up talking about cricket, so we should probably stop there.
Put together on the related topic of the under-intellectualization of everyday life. But before that, let's thank Emma very much.